Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. I can see a number of us joining here for today's webinar. I'll just give it another minute. I think sometimes we're just rushing in to attend these events. We'll just give it another moment and we'll be underway. But you're in the right spot. Okay, so good morning and welcome everyone to today's webinar, How to Get to Net Zero Without Costing the Earth. My name is John Huggart, the CEO of Energy Action. My pleasure to welcome today with me Barbara Albert, the co-CEO of 100% Renewables. Welcome, Barbara.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for everyone joining us. We're really excited today. I know we've got many customers from Energy Action, many friends of the business or new customers as well for both ourselves and for 100% Renewables. Today, our intention is to provide you a webinar that'll run to about 45 minutes. We are expecting our presentation to go for about 30 minutes and then leave plentiful time for your questions and for us to provide answers to you as well. We will be recording this session, so we'll make it available to you after this session if there's something you missed or you want to catch up on, and we'll also be providing you additional information after the webinar as well. So thank you once again for attending. So look, just to kick us off, I need to introduce our co-host here because for many of our guests, Barbara Albert is the co-CEO of 100% Renewables. They're dedicated to developing net zero pathways for their clients. And Barbara is a speaker and award-winning author of her book, Energy Unlimited, regularly sharing her experiences on the company's blog, the YouTube channel, and she's also got her own podcast, Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions.
And I have the pleasure to introduce John. John is an experienced leader and senior executive with a strong energy background. He's a board member of the Energy Efficiency Council and fellow of the Australian CPAs. He's an expert in carbon neutral and renewable energy procurement, precinct generation projects, and solar businesses.
You've come to the right place. We're all passionate and dedicated to this area. So excited to share some of these learnings today. And that's why we've got 100% Renewables here. So Barbara, let us know a little bit about your organisation before we kick off.
Sure. So at 100% Renewables, we see a future where all organizations are powered with renewables and have zero net emissions. And it's our mission to help business achieve this by driving net profit with zero emissions. We are experts in delivering net zero strategies that have buy-in and are cost effective.
Thank you so much. And again, for those who are new to Energy Action, look, we're really dedicated to making energy simpler, cleaner, and lower cost. We've been around for over 20 years, so launched famous for our auctions where we can create competitive tension for business spend on energy across Australia. And as a result, we're now representing about 10% of that commercial load across Australia. We're listed on the stock exchange, got teams around Australia dedicated to help customers on their journey towards net zero. But the reason we're here today, and incredible timing, last week the IPCC report came out. It is code red. I guess it was a wake-up call again for change. So today is not so much about informing the requirement to change or the need to change. It is about how do we make change that can meet this collective requirement. So that's the focus of today. What we do is we go and speak to our clients every 6 months or so in a survey, and we get some really important feedback. And what you can see here is that people want to take action on net zero. It's almost a universal requirement now. 85% believe their organisation needs to do something with net zero, but only just over 27% have actually got a plan in place right now. So there is a disconnect. Now, we know there are many leaders in the organisation, including in Australia and globally, who've made a lot of effort, but we also know there's a large market that is still grappling with these decisions. How do you put a plan in place and how do you achieve that outcome? Let's talk about net zero. What does it actually mean? We all have an environmental footprint. You're probably generally familiar with that, and Barbara will talk about how do you measure it and what are the boundaries and scopes of that. But generally, as an idea, we've got a footprint. And if we're going to get to net zero, we're going to reduce that footprint to zero. How do we do that? First of all, we can reduce. That's energy efficiency typically, or avoidance of energy use. Wear a warmer jacket on a colder day. All those type of efforts are required to reduce the energy that you use and the emissions you create. After that, can you generate energy yourself on the roof through solar, for example? If you are still reliant on grid power, let's buy 100% renewable energy. And then finally, with your footprint, and Barbara will talk about the scope of this, there will be offset requirements with carbon credits typically required to get you down to that magic zero number. So I'm going to hand over to Barbara now to talk about those methods to get to net zero.
So let's see if I can get control. Perfect. So there are many ways you can achieve net zero emissions. There are no right and wrong approaches, and you can go about this in a way that fits your particular circumstances, your size, your engagement with policy and science-based responses to climate change, the abatement efforts you've already made in the past, and what you can commit to now in terms of resources. The steps that I'm showing you here probably reflect the ideal way of achieving net zero emissions. Here, an organization understands the science and they have to act. The first step for organizations that follow this particular idealized pathway is to set a net zero target year in line with science. So you may have seen the latest IPCC report. And to set the boundary of what emission sources you will include in your net zero target. Ideally, the boundary of emission sources reflects all your material emissions in your operations and in your value chain. For example, aligned with the Australian Climate Active Standard. You then move on to develop your carbon footprint. You analyze how your emissions will grow over time, and you project what the expected future emissions will be. You'll then develop a plan to achieve net zero emissions. You develop business cases that are cost effective and staged over time. And then you plan for these projects to be delivered. You implement the committed actions. And then in the target year, you achieve your net zero emissions. Now that's an ideal case, but of course, this happens for some organizations, but not others. So we find that in many cases, you set a net zero target, but you are unaware that your net zero target should ideally include a number of emission sources, which you may not have previously tracked, or you may not even be aware of them. So you might start with looking at your electricity emissions, your emissions from natural gas use, from your fleet. But as you start working on your footprint and you start liaising with others in the sector and consultants, you uncover that there are many other emission sources that you may not have considered previously, but that you can influence, such as, for instance, emissions in the supply chain through products and services you buy, or emissions from refrigerant gases in your buildings. Now, this typically leads to an iterative process where you assess and decide on what emission sources you should include based on their significance and also your ability to influence them. A good guide for businesses in this step is the Climate Active Standard. So Climate Active, and John, you might be able to talk to that from Energy Action's experience, has requirements on what emission sources must be included in your carbon footprint. Even if you're not looking to be certified just yet under the standard, you can still use the standard to guide you in developing your emissions boundary. Now, the boundary under Climate Active is usually broader than emission sources that are under your direct control. So other businesses may not yet be thinking about the supply chain emissions or setting a net zero target at all. They may have owners and stakeholders who just don't see net zero as a high priority in the business. And that's fine too. Many of our clients start out with a set target or boundary in mind. They typically want to understand their own emissions, typically from energy, transport, perhaps from waste, and are not keen to think of other additional emission sources. If this is you, then you're mostly interested in opportunities that will save you money and a plan that can help you achieve ambitious renewable energy or carbon reduction goals. A good way to get thinking about Scope 3 emissions is to change procurement so that both money spent and emissions reduce. Now, going back to John's earlier slide, most businesses recognize the need to act, but few have set a target. So the scenario outlined here is, in our experience, the most common we come across all the time. But we believe that as the need to go to net zero becomes more normalized, and you would have seen that in the news just how many net zero commitments have come out in the past few months, this approach that I show you here will apply less and less, and more businesses will start out with an overarching goal to have zero emissions as a top-down approach, even if they don't know exactly what should be included. Now, I mentioned the word emission sources quite a lot in my previous slides. Let's have a look at that in greater detail. When you commit to a net zero goal, which emission sources will you include in your goal? And here is my famous onion graphic. Most businesses are aware of their Scope 1 carbon footprint, which is emissions that come from burning natural gas or the fuel in company cars. And most of you would be aware of your Scope 2 emissions, which is the use of electricity. However, there is usually a lack of awareness of Scope 3 emissions, which happen both upstream and downstream of your business. Examples of your value chain emissions are upstream energy distribution losses, paper consumption, waste, or air travel. But when you look into your value chain emissions, it's hard to stop. There are many emission sources that you could potentially include in your carbon footprint. But of course, your resources aren't endless, so you have to draw the line somewhere. This line will determine the boundary which you will take to the starting line of your net zero journey. And here's another way of looking at Scope 3 emissions. So that's your value chain emissions. In the middle, you have the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions that I showed you earlier. These are under your control. But to the left of the blue box, you have upstream emissions that come from products and services you buy. And to the right, you have downstream activities which happen as a result of your activities. Now, this picture here shows you all the emission sources that occur because your business exists. To give you an example, one of the most important Scope 3 upstream emission sources that you can sometimes overlook is category 1, which is purchased goods and services. Think of all the products and services such as raw material inputs or services you buy in your business. They were most likely produced by burning fossil fuels, so they contribute to your carbon footprint. Now, here is an example of an extensive carbon footprint we developed for one of our clients. So you've got the tons of carbon emissions on the vertical axis and the timeline on the horizontal axis. So here are the Scope 1 emissions. Here are the Scope 2 emissions, and you can see it's a big emission source, and that's the case for most organizations. And here are the Scope 3 emissions. As you can see, electricity emissions are by far the biggest emission source. As I said, it's typical. And this is, in this particular case, this is followed by purchased food and catering, which is a big emissions source for this particular client, followed by purchasing professional services. So given that you have this carbon footprint, let's have a look at how you can reduce this carbon footprint to net zero over time. So examples are energy efficient air conditioning, energy efficient lighting, putting solar panels on roofs, but also land where you've got it, adding battery storage when that becomes cost effective, buying renewables, that's a very important consideration, sustainable transport, sustainable design, because that affects both your operational emissions, but also embedded emissions in the building materials. Talking about building materials, you could switch to carbon neutral inputs, an example here of carbon neutral bricks. You can think about reducing your consumption, so giving an example here of paper, but it applies to anything else as well. Purchasing carbon neutral products or environmentally friendly products, looking at circular economy initiatives, switching to carbon neutral flying once we can get back to flying. And of course, purchasing carbon offsets as the last resort, or alternatively, you can use it to become carbon neutral right away. So given that we've seen all these solutions, how does this work in a pathway? Here is a net zero pathway we developed for one of our clients that is based on the footprint I showed you earlier. Now, in the absence of any carbon reduction activities, emissions will grow as the company grows. However, because the grid is getting greener, your electricity-related emissions will fall automatically without you doing anything, because more renewables are being added to the grid. Now, this happens over time. You'll rarely achieve net zero emissions with a single silver bullet solution. So there are many opportunities that contribute to a net zero goal, such as energy efficiency, on-site solar and batteries, renewable energy purchasing, waste management, fleet electrification, and supply chain initiatives. Now, as you can see, grid decarbonization happens slowly. You can't wait for grid decarbonization to take care of your electricity-related emissions. Businesses and also individuals need to act now themselves with actions like efficiency, solar, and buying renewables that reduce emissions and save money. Over the next 1 or 2 decades, then, depending on what makes up your value chain or your scope 3 emissions, you can work with customers, suppliers, and your other stakeholders to drive these down while creating new opportunities for your business to prosper over the long term. Now, you can focus on reducing emissions in your supply chain over time, and then eventually buying carbon offsets. So only use carbon offsets for emissions that are too hard to reduce or remove directly. But as I said earlier, purchasing carbon offsets is still a great strategy, as it shows climate change leadership, and it sort of sets an internal price on carbon. So it makes other projects more easy to implement. But over time, the goal should be to reduce your carbon offset purchase to 0 while reaching net zero emissions. So you can go carbon neutral now and look to go net zero while minimizing carbon offset purchases in future. And with that, I'm handing back over to John.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barbara, and I really appreciate the update there from Melissa. Well spotted. Those carbon neutral bricks available from Austral Bricks. So thank you for that comment, and congratulations on that initiative as well, of how organisations can look through the entire supply chain to create these ambitions. So I'd like to just talk a little bit now about on the price of energy. This squiggly graph on the screen there demonstrates the data from thousands of procurement events over the past many years, and you can see right now that downward trend that we've enjoyed. The best time to ever do your lock-in your energy contract was March the 21st this year. There's been a bit of a rally since then, and it's, you know, with the colder winter and some withdrawal of supply. But generally, it's been a very good time to buy energy as a result of the supply and demand between renewables on the grid now. But buying renewable energy is a combination of this grid power together with the large-scale generation certificates that combine into being renewable energy. Now, on this market that we show here, these large-scale generation certificate prices, LGC prices, are firming. They're still representing value, clearly, from today's prices into the future, but you can see them firming up. So even over the last 6 months, some increases there. So that's just a bit of a guide as to the future. So we're still seeing value, but some increases in the short term. So what ways can you achieve renewable energy? Well, the first way is to buy green power. This was a great initiative from the government almost 10 years ago. Had so many benefits, and we use it here at Energy Action as a small business. It's flexible, it's short term, it's government accredited. You do now have an opportunity to connect that to a specific renewable source. But on the other hand, people have really voted against it. So you've seen a significant drop in the use for businesses of green energy, and typically, unless you go for the Green Power Connect product, which is more expensive, there's no direct link to a source. The other way many of our clients are managing their commitments to renewable energy is through LGCs. It's certainly a lower cost compared to green power, It can be short-term or long-term as well. It's government accredited still. It's a very transparent market. It can be actively managed so you can find the right time to trade and buy. On the negative side, there's no direct link to the generation source. So whilst you're meeting your 100% renewable targets pragmatically, you're not getting the benefit of the link to that specific asset, which can be shown on your annual report or to your shareholders, to your staff. The alternative, of course, has been the corporate power purchase agreements, which creates a great opportunity to go direct, cut out the middleman, go direct to the source, the renewable energy generation source. Typically is requiring a very long-term commitment and contract, which is good because you've got certainty. On the other hand, there's a number of risks that we've certainly called out. It's certainly something to be aware of, the project risk, the timing risk. And we've already seen a number of these agreements that are certainly out of the money and even after a short time of their inception, let alone the fact that it can take 2 years from commencement to, or 3 years from negotiation to fulfillment. So a new way of buying is what we've introduced more recently is the green auction, which is a renewable-backed energy supply agreement. So think about a traditional energy supply agreement, but through a highly transparent auction process so that it creates that competitive tension, but still giving you the benefit of that direct link to that generation source. So that's very exciting innovation for us, and we're really excited because our first green auction has just been completed. We'll make details of that known when it's all publicly available. We've got our second one just about to go underway right now. If you're considering buying renewable energy, we can talk to you about how that works and how effective it's been for our clients who've already made that decision. The other way you can be cost effective in your net zero plans is through effective solar procurement. And we've introduced more recently the solar auctions now. Many organisations have now committed through that process. And what it does is creates that traditional auction process, which has been terrific for the commodity energy supply, now being applied to that more complex solar system installation or a power purchase agreement, so effectively to rent solar power from your roof without spending the capital. And the cool thing is you're getting that maximum tension. We saw one there, a recent solar auction, there was a 42% reduction in the cost from the original bids. So from the initial offers through to a final close price. So typically, we've not been able to do auctions on this in the past because it's quite a complex thing with solar, right? You know, you've got to deal with roof integrity and switchboard configurations and access requirements. We now deal with that all up front and get a highly effective auction process to secure a great deal for your organisation. As Barbara said, we're on our own net zero story, and we've chosen, again, our Climate Active for our certification. We're a small business, right? So we've got a few leased premises in Australia. We've got teams across the Philippines and in Australia, and we've set our own net zero target. We're going through that process at the moment, submitting for approval with Climate Active as we speak. Now, this template that we've used and our own plan is publicly available on our website because we want to just share our own story and experiences of how we can get to net zero. So in summary, Barbara, I'll hand it over to you. These are the key messages that we wanted to share in today's session, and very keen to hear your questions, and we can respond to those as well.
So in my opinion, setting a net zero target doesn't have to be difficult or expensive. I reckon you should look at your options and identify the ones that best suit your needs. What's important is to get started. Don't delay action. We only have this decade in which we can change the course of action. So everyone has to act, including businesses. So that's my call to action, to plan for your net zero journey and to start implementing actions right away. And with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions. So both John and I will be available to answer your questions. So shall we have a look at the first one?
Yeah.
So Ed has asked whether the recent update to the IPCC report implies that we should be pursuing net zero by 2030 to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees, whether that flows straight through to the SBTi, and should organizations be reassessing the target in light of this report. So for those that are not aware of SBTIs, it's a science-based target initiative, which is a fantastic organization that allows organizations to set themselves pathways in alignment to a 1.5-degree pathway. Unfortunately, the SBTI only gives us guidance for the next 5 to 15 years. It doesn't go right down to net zero. But according to the latest science that's been revealed in the Working Group 1 report of the latest IPCC report, a net zero target by 2050 is just not good enough. It will cause catastrophic climate change. So in all reality, we should be striving to reach net zero by 2040, but with a focus on decarbonization this decade. So get rid of the emissions that you can reduce right now through efficiency, on-site solar and purchasing renewables. Reduce that right now. It's under your control. You can deal with those emissions immediately. And then later on, you can deal with supply chain emissions over the next 2 decades to take you to a net zero target by 2040 is a good way of thinking about it. So 2050 is just too late. And then also, John, what's your opinion regarding the latest IPCC report and science-based targets?
Well, I think you've answered that very well. I might just, and I think the urgency is apparent. I think what I might just address is a question here on what's driving that LGC pricing increasing. And look, the answer is there has been a little bit of uncertainty about the renewable energy target. It closes out in a few years' time, but it is clearly the instrument of choice for a number of businesses making decisions either through RE100 commitments or through their net zero commitments. So that voluntary commitment from large corporate across Australia is really driving that price signal. Now, I believe that price signal will stimulate further supply from renewables. So what we've got is a large pool of investments still at financial close, and we believe that this demand will drive additional renewables into the system.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question here on the SAF certificates. Barbara, did you want to answer that one at all?
What are SAF certificates?
Might be a question for Barbara, who's raised that question. I think in terms of certificates, in terms of carbon certificates, the most popular ones in Australia, of course, the ACCU or the
Sustainable Aviation Fuel certificates.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Oh, right. Okay. That sounds like a great initiative. So I have to look that up. Awesome.
Okay. We built the northern roof of the angle corresponding to our latitude and then put solar panels onto it. Yeah, look, that's sustainable. That's a great example of sustainable environment. Where do I start? Where do I even start with working out emissions across all scopes? Look, that's a great question, and really, for when you do your net zero plan, it can be quite daunting because as Barbara described, the onion skin, it can take some effort. The first part, of course, it does start with the most measurable, which is typically your energy bill. And most energy providers, and certainly under our managed services for our clients, we provide the emissions in respect of your scope 2 emissions and your energy procurement from the grid. Where you've got gas, similarly, we will do that as well. But I think that's a question that just reach out to us. We can speak to our account manager and our experts here at Energy Action of how we work out those emissions. Did you want to add to that, Barbara, as well?
Yeah, for sure. So in the materials that are being sent to you, as well as the recording, just after the onion graphic, I'm showing the upstream and downstream emissions that happen upstream and downstream of your organization, and that has 15 categories of scope 3 emissions that you can go through, and you can start thinking about those. So for instance, do you want to account for the products and the services that you purchase in your organization? Do you want to account for the emissions that are associated with employees commuting to your place of work? do want to take account of all your air travel. So it just broadens your mind as to what all sorts of emission sources that are happening in your organization. But as I mentioned in my onion graphic, somewhere you've got to draw the line because your resources are constrained and you can't do it all. So you have to focus on the ones that you have the most immediate control over and that you can influence.
There's another question here as well about solar decisions and whether, because those LGC prices are coming down, should you advance or defer a decision on solar? So look, our advice typically is there's still terrific value on solar installation for business especially. And the reason it's very strong for business is because typically the business is absorbing the use of that solar power in their operations rather than being exposed to export. So they can capture the entire value compared to grid supplied energy, including network charges. So typically that's still where the value proposition lies. In terms of the timing, in terms of Victoria, if you've got a roof, go for it. Right now under the scheme, it is the perfect time. If you're not thinking about solar in Victoria right now, please reach out to us and we'll chat to you about how you can evaluate that quickly and make some real changes. Broadly across Australia though, whilst the LGC prices are coming down, that value chain from a long-term point of view certainly represents value. And what you'll see now is organisations willing to provide you the option of supplying and installing at a fixed capital cost, or alternatively simply reaching an agreement with yourselves and the use of your roof, and then providing you an alternative to grid power at a lower sustainable price and fixed prices over a long term. So on both those counts, it's worthwhile evaluating solar still.
Mm-hmm. And another question we had from Sydney, Clarice, is due to the latest COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing lockdowns, is it safe to say that they will have a positive impact on the Scope 3 emissions of companies? So this is what happens with most employees working from home. You can assume that electricity consumption in the office is reduced, but at the same time, there is more electricity consumption happening at home. From an employee commute perspective, your employee commute emissions reduce because obviously we're not going to our offices, sadly. So that emission source is reduced. So in the end, it works out to be a positive effect on the carbon footprint. So it's usually a reduction because of the working from home. But then, of course, if you think about all the other things that happen, there's still purchased products and services. There's still waste that's being generated. So all these other emission sources are still there. And so there's a little bit of an effect and definitely a reduction in air travel related emissions. But that's about it. So there's not a huge effect, but obviously if you compare 2019 footprints to 2020 footprints, there's a huge difference because there's less activity. So there are fewer emissions, but we need to see even fewer.
There's a follow-up question, I think it's from Damon, about how our first green auction went. I didn't give a lot of details on that. As I say, it's not publicly available information yet. The cool thing I can say is that this iconic Australian organisation was able to achieve 100% renewable energy through the green auction process, commencing from July next year at a lower total spend than their current energy. Now, that comes from two factors. Obviously, as we talked about earlier, the grid energy prices have come down, so that was a source of value, but also comes from the competitive tension. This was a keenly sought after, strong bidding event for many innovative and strong retailers across Australia. So we invited about 12 retailers to the event who expressed interest, and then 6 actually submitted bids. This is a new product for them, so they're still developing these solutions by providing this bundled price, including the LGCs and the grid power to provide the 100% renewable energy with an identified project as well. So as a result, we've got a very, very happy client and a very terrific outcome for the environment as well as then commercially. So we'll look forward to sharing that. I see another note here as well about the opportunity to incorporate a renewable-backed energy supply agreement against neighbours' determination. So that's a very good, very specific point on commercial buildings that we're working through at the moment. We feel that success will be met there, but it is a process to go through. So I'm not sure if we've got a specific answer to that one. Ed, I know you're very close to that, whether you're able to provide a specific answer to that question from James. Barbara, if you want to answer that question from Graham about the target country.
Yeah, I get this question all the time because it's so confusing with the scope 3s, because with scope 3s there is double counting. So there is never going to be double counting for scope 1 emissions, sometimes for scope 2, but for scope 3s, definitely. So if you take care of embodied emissions of products and services that you purchase, you are taking responsibility for another organization's scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So they might be counting it, and you might be counting it in your carbon boundary. Now, at the moment, this is unavoidable because we're not living in an ideal world, and not everyone is accounting for their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, because then we wouldn't have to worry about scope 3 emissions. So with the double counting issue, the good thing is that if you include it in your carbon footprint, you have now the ability to influence this emission source. So you can talk to your supplier and you can influence them to reduce their emissions. And if others are doing that too, there's even more pressure on your supplier to reduce their emissions. And maybe then with that pressure, they are going to maybe commit to a science-based target. Maybe they're committing to a long-term net zero goal. Maybe they are going carbon neutral, in which case the input into your business becomes carbon neutral and you don't have to worry about it at all. So yes, there is double counting, but it is a good thing because you want to have that influence over your supply chain.
Thanks, Barbara. And just coming back to that question about the neighbours certification. So look, what we've spoken to about with the retailers now is about bundling under the green auction the ability to have qualifying green power. So that's the direct answer. We have been in those discussions, and we feel confident now that we can bring a competitive tension to achieving that bundled outcome whilst meeting neighbours' requirements as well. So I think that's a terrific innovation and step forward for us. So yeah, reach out to us after this webinar if you like, and we can pick up on the details of that. There's a couple of other questions here. Here's a good one for you, Barbara, is what's the most common mistake organisations make when preparing a net zero plan?
Probably preparing a plan in isolation without consulting all key organizational stakeholders, because that results in a plan that sits somewhere, gets buried, last straw kind of thing, and doesn't get implemented. Because if you bring your key stakeholders on the journey with you, it ensures buy-in, which then ensures that your plan gets implemented and that resources are being made available. So that I would say would be the biggest mistake, just developing the plan in complete isolation.
Good point. I've got a question here from Nicholas. So what will the likely impact, timing and financial from the recent New South Wales State Budget announcement regarding renewables? Well, this is a significant plan and step. And what the real impact of the New South Wales government approach here is to bring a number of renewable energy projects to financial close, because they will have the certainty of government-backed investment with those projects, guaranteeing certain offtake prices as a CFD, I'd imagine, as a contract for differences, to ensure that there's a certainty around the price that that project can achieve. That'll be a financial instrument for the project, but what it will really mean in broader terms is that there will be increasing supply of renewables in the grid. And that, as we know right now, I think I looked at the market screens this morning at 9 o'clock, and the price of power in Australia in the NEM certainly was free. I think it was drifting between 0 to 0.006 cents. It was just extraordinary. So the increase in renewables through that initiative from the New South Wales state government will have an impact on reducing prices into the future with increased supply of renewables. They're doing that, however, in concert with the Renewable Energy Zone to make sure the infrastructure and support for the management of the grid that from a technical level is supported to enable that. And it's really in concert with the large-scale battery impact, ultimately of Snowy Hydro 2.0, for example, for that ability to sustain the departure of the coal-fired generators in the future.
Great. And we have two questions from councils. One in relation to whether bitumen and concrete should be used in council projects, where that should be part of the carbon footprint. So I've got one thing to say about councils' roads, rates and rubbish. So definitely asphalt and bitumen should be included because of fixing the roads is just such an important part of council operations. So there's no way to navigate around that. That should be in your carbon footprint. But when it comes to capital works, yes, the tendency nowadays is to include more and more emission sources. So previously, capital works wasn't so much a part of organizations' carbon footprints. There's a lot of emissions associated with it. But more and more, this forms part of the emissions boundary. So it's being extended every year. We see more and more emission sources being added to council's carbon footprints. So that's definitely happening. And in relation to the community, the pathway is pretty similar to the pathways that I've showed for organizations. So you have to start with setting a target, set a target year for when the community should be net zero. You should be looking at the carbon footprint. So you could use, for instance, the snapshot that's being provided by BZE for the community to see what the community carbon footprint looks like. Get a mandate from the community by looking at what the community strategic plan says, for instance, undertaking a community survey, and then developing a plan and implementing the plan. So it's a very similar process.
I think so. I think what the key to that, especially for a council and community, becomes communication. So that ends up being the key requirement. Look, we are at time now. I know that we promised to end in about 45 minutes. I think we're meeting that requirement. I want to thank you all. I know we haven't answered all your questions, so that's something we can pick up with after that. All of our contact details are here for both Barbara and myself. Feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much for your interest and attention to the webinar today. And thank you so much to my co-host, Barbara, for entertaining what I think has been a very important and hopefully helpful chat to all of your attendees.
Thanks very much for having me, John. It was a great webinar, and thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah, thanks so much, Barbara. Thank you, everyone. We'll close out now and wish you all a good day ahead and all the best for your net zero journey.